Good afternoon. My name is Barbara Hogue. I'm the chapter coordinator for the Institute for Classical Architecture and Art in the Philadelphia chapter. The ICAA is dedicated to advancing the appreciation and practice of the principles of traditional architecture and its allied arts by engaging educators, professionals, students, and enthusiasts. We're thrilled to have been invited to co-present this lecture with the Philadelphia Club, where it originated, with Jay Stiefel, and we'd like to send a warm thank you to our sponsors, Capoletti Builders, North American Windows and Doors, Peter Zimmerman Architects in Pine Mar, Archer and Buchanan Architects, Duration Molding, John Milner Architects, LaPage Millwork, Rittenhouse Builders, Spire Builders, and Tradewood Windows and Doors. With our gratitude, we thank you for your support, and I will turn over the speaking to Jay Stiefel of the Philadelphia Club, who will introduce Caroline Tonna.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Unfortunately, I have no list of sponsors, but the Philadelphia Club and its members are most grateful to Caroline for accepting our invitation today. And we're pleased to welcome all of you to our Distinguished Speaker Series at the Philadelphia Club. And on behalf of the club, I'd like to offer a warm welcome and also to acknowledge the presence of Their Excellencies Keith Azzopardi, Malta's ambassador to the US, and its honorary consul, my fellow club member, Frank Giordano. We're also pleased to have with us, in addition to members of the local chapter and nationally of ICAA, and our club members and their guests, the patrons of the Fondazione Patrimoni Malti, and the Friends of the Palazzo Falson. I was pleased to learn from Barbara this morning that over 350 have signed up for today's talk. And that's not quite the 1,000 ships that Helen of Troy launched, but I think we should be very grateful for that number. And I'm sure it's no doubt due to both the beauty and of our speaker and the curiosity that all of us have with her subject. And Caroline is a well-known art historian, and she's curator of the Palazzo Falson, and which is an 800-year-old historic house museum. And we're pleased to have her talk about its collections, its history, and also about Malta, because it's a country that's little known to many of us over here. A few words about Caroline. She has developed I might say, an international reputation as an expert on 19th century dress photography, dress history and photography. And we look forward to her forthcoming book, Fashioning Malta in Early Photography, which is based on her years of research in both subjects. Caroline is well known to Maltese audiences for the many programs she's produced on radio and television about Malta and its culture. She holds degrees in anthropology and art history, and will give us the benefit of her knowledge in both areas today. She also is one of the administrators of the Notarial Archives Foundation, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which I understand preserves Malta's documentary heritage. It's my personal pleasure to introduce Caroline Tonna. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jay, and thank you, Barbara, for welcoming me to give this online talk. And thanks as well to the Philadelphia Club and the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. So right now it's 6 o'clock Malta time, but to avoid any confusion, I am not calling from one of the many towns that are named Malta in the United States, but from the very island of Malta, located here, marked in the green circle. The group of Maltese islands is just very close to Italy and below Sicily, just 60 miles away actually from Sicily. And if you had to walk straight across Malta, the distance would only measure around 19 miles. However, despite Malta's diminutive size, it has played a key role throughout history in the events of the region. Its strategic position served a bridge between Europe and North Africa. But there is no doubt that culturally, much of what makes Malta today, despite its Semitic language, has been heavily nourished by the historical links with European continent, especially Italy, France, and England. Now I would like to introduce you to our museum, Palazzo Falson, where I work as a curator, and the last resident who lived there until 1962, Captain Olaf Golscher. He came from a family of mixed Swedish and Maltese descent, and the family owned and ran a shipping business that survived to this very day. However, Olaf wasn't very much interested in the family business. He had a passion for art and culture, and that is how he dedicated most of his life. He was a charming man, he was an artist, he was passionate about land archaeology, he pioneered underwater archaeology, and above all, he was an avid collector and a philanthropist. So when Olaf Golscher bought Palazzo Falson together with his mother in those days in 1927, it became his life project, and he wanted to preserve the unique historic architectural features of this palazzo and embellish it further with, in his own taste, but also with rather a historistic style. He made this, a dream home where he could place all the collections that he amassed throughout his life. And it was an ideal setting. During this presentation, what I'm trying to do is to go through Olaf Golscher's life and some of the collections that we have in the museum, and sort of place them in different periods of the cultural history of Malta. So please allow me to touch on a few historical episodes. So Malta was first inhabited around 5,900 before Central Era, and our Neolithic temples date from 3,200 before Central Era. The great megalithic complexes of Hajar-im, Imnaidra, and Gigantia are the oldest freestanding stone edifices in the world. And to give you an idea, they're around 1,000 years older than the Stonehenge. And we have as many as 5 sites in Malta that have been listed as World Heritage Sites by UNESCO. The first people who colonized Malta were the Phoenicians in 700 before Central Era. And now we move to 218 before Central Era, when Malta became part of the Roman Empire after ousting the Carthaginians. The island prospered under the Roman rule, and we still have Roman remains. For example, the Domus Romana, here seen in the picture, which is a charming home that belonged to a rich Roman aristocrat. And excavations revealed this beautiful, sophisticated, geometric Pompeian-style mosaic floor that is found in the grand central courtyard of the Domus Romana. And at Palazzo Falson, we have 2 Roman glass pieces, a tapering perfume bottle with a bulbous base that you can see on the left-hand side, and another bottle made of colored glass. Now, the Romans paid much attention to cleanliness and used luxury goods such as oils and perfumes and even cosmetics in their daily regime, which they kept in containers like these called unguentarium, balsamari, and ariballos. And such artifacts have been dug up in both domestic and funerary environments. Another important episode that happened during the Roman era, around 60 Central Era now, is when Christianity was introduced to the islands. Apostles Paul of Tarsus and Luke the Evangelist were shipwrecked on our rocky island on the way when they were facing trial in Rome. It is believed that Paul preached to the local population, and this is how Christianity was born in Malta. Yet, contrary to this general belief, it didn't just switch immediately to Christianity, because there was still belief in Roman pagans and even the emperor that continued to be worshipped from the 1st to the 3rd century. Here you're seeing a statue, a silver statue, quite a rare piece, which is the statue of St. Paul at the Metropolitan Museum, also in Mdina, where our palazzo is, very close by, and encircled in the green circle there is a statue of St. Paul. We have many statues of St. Paul in Malta, but this is a particular one because it is on the islands of St. Paul. This was erected in about 1845 and it still stands there. And close by, there is also another statue of Christ, but obviously you cannot see it because it was placed underwater on the occasion of the visit of Pope John Paul II, who visited Malta in 1990. We move on, then the Vandals and the Goths took over from the Romans, and later in the course of the Islamic conquest, the Arabs arrived in 870. Studies show that Palazzo Falson was built on the early site in Mdina known as La Rocca, which was part of the Muslim defensive system during their occupation. And the Arab legacy that was left in Malta is definitely the Maltese language, which is the only Semitic tongue using Latin script. Arabs also introduced the new crops in Malta, such as cotton and citrus fruits, and introduced innovative agricultural irrigation. The cotton industry continued to flourish. It became one of the most important exports traded. And at Palazzo Falson, we have this simple 19th century spinning wheel that was used by peasant women and young children who would normally sit or squat on the ground to operate this spinning wheel. The Arab rule in Malta came to an end when the Romans crossed over from Sicily and they took over. Later in the Middle Ages, Malta was passed to the Royal House of Aragon and then to the Spanish crown. But Olive Golsher had named the palazzo as Norman House because he really believed that it dated to the Norman period. But when Fondazione Patrimonio Malti restored the palazzo, it renamed Norman House to Palazzo Falson with reference to the earliest documented residence of the house, the De Falsone family. Now notice a bit the facade. So on the left-hand side is a watercolor, an early 19th century watercolor by Charles Frederick de Brogdorf, which shows the facade. Not much has been changed really. It's quite plain and rigid as a structural design, but it is decorated with a double serrated string course that separates the ground floor to the first floor. Maybe you can see it better on the recent picture on the right-hand side of this presentation. Notice also the heavy front doors with the pointed arch and what we call the triple hood molding of the doors and the mullion windows on the top floor known as the piano nobile. We now walk inside the museum. This is the oldest part of the museum, as you can see from the thick walls that suggest that it was built like a fort. And during the restoration of Palazzo Falson by Fondazione Patrimonio Malti, that now obviously runs the museum, the doorway on the left-hand side was discovered. The pointed arch indicates that it dates back to the 13th century, and even the floor level is lower than it is today. And now we come to a very important milestone in Maltese history. The arrival of the Knights of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, known as the Knights of Malta, who were granted possession of the islands in 1530 as their new base by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. This sovereign military order, created in 1102, is the oldest surviving aristocratic order, initially dedicated to look after the safety and health of pilgrims to Jerusalem. Their mission was to defend Christianity against Islam, and after the loss of the Holy Land, it became a naval order for which Malta was obviously an ideal base, since it was such strategically positioned in the center of the Mediterranean. Now, Palazzo Falson has very strong connection with the Knights of Malta, because the first Grand Master, Philippe Villiers de l'Isle-Adam, had stayed at the Patrician House between October and November in 1530 as a guest of honor during his first visit to Mdina. And in 1567, the victory of the Knights and the people of Malta over the Ottoman fleet that had landed on the island to besiege it was definitely a defining moment for Christian Europe. Palazzo Falson has a set of unique engravings recording the Great Siege, which is fundamental to understand the dynamics of this historic battle. But additional to that, we also have the journal written by an eyewitness of the siege, the Italian soldier Francesco Balbi di Correggio, that he wrote it in Spanish, and then the maternal uncle of Olaf Golscher had translated it into English. And later on in life, Olaf Golscher also played an instrumental role to publish this book in 1961. In our armory room, we have existing typical armor of the siege of the Great Siege of 1565. This type of suit of armor on the left was worn by foot soldiers during the Great Siege. It is made of iron and normally termed munition armor. And another fine example is the helmet, which is a very heavy helmet, as you can see, that was also used during the period of the night, particularly by cavalry and foot soldiers involved in direct combat. As I said, the victory of the siege was a turning point for the Knights of Malta, and Grand Master Jean de Valette built a new fortified city named after him, Valletta. It is one of the cities that is built on a grid model, and it was planned from scratch. The knights came from aristocratic families, and they bestowed their considerable wealth to their new conventual church in Valletta, dedicated to their patron, Saint John. Its facade is rather plain, but the interiors are so opulent with dazzling decorations, and there's the ceilings are all painted. It's fresco by Mattia Preti, who was a master of Baroque in the early 1600s. And there is an abundance of superb marbling and gilding. Also notice on the right-hand side, it doesn't, the picture doesn't do it justice, but these are inlaid marble funerary stones covering the entire floor of the cathedral. And as patron of the arts, the Knights of Malta left a legacy in Maltese architecture, painting, and sculpture. And the most famous works of art bequeathed is the painting of the beheading of St. John at St. John's Co-Cathedral in Valletta, painted by Michelangelo Merisi di Caravaggio, and it is the only signed work in the world by the master. And true to their vocation, the Knights also built the Sacra Infermeria, which was the foremost hospital of Europe in its day. Malta is also blessed with extensive archives and a rich documentation of the Knights in our National Library, including the original of Emperor Charles' grant of the island to the Knights. Which brings us to our library at Palazzo Falson, that contains over 4,000 books and highly valuable manuscripts, mostly historic and literary works in various languages. Prominent among the collection is an official history of the Order of St. John, dell'Historia della Sacra Religione, by Giacomo Bosio in the late 16th century. You may perhaps be familiar with the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library of St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota, which works to preserve and give access to the world's manuscripts through digitalization. It holds the world's largest collection of resources for study of manuscript cultures. It also has a Malta Study Center that includes Palazzo Falson prestigious books that relate to the history of Malta and the Order of St. John, known as the Melitensia collection. And in order to join the Order of St. John, prosperous members had to prove their line of nobility. And hanging in our documentation room at Palazzo Falson is a set of remarkable gilded and illuminated manuscripts detailing the ancestry of a prospective member. So such documents had to be presented to the order before joining the organization. And now we move to have a look at fine pieces of furniture that we have in the museum that date back during the period of the Knights. The scoffer, known in Maltese as splendour, is an example of one of the first Maltese furnitures made locally. It was mostly used as a bridal chest to put dowries there, like clothes, towels, and things that you would need when one gets married, but it also was a makeshift bed. So the top part would serve as a bed, as a sleeping area where you can put maybe just a pillow and a blanket, and it would serve as a bed. However, perhaps it was also used in that way because inside the coffer there would be a secret compartment for jewelry and money. Later, it became more practical to have a chest of drawers known as gradenza. Palazzo Falson is credited with this beautiful early 18th century chest of drawers. It's veneered with olive wood and walnut, and it's decorated with inlaid orange wood medallions in lacework design. And the art of inlay in Malta was introduced during the 17th century through Italian craftsmen who worked locally and whom would have been employed by the Order of St. John. This is a Maltese prie-dieu, what is known as a kneeler or a praying desk that dates to the 17th century. It is also made of walnut and olive wood on orange wood background, and it has storage space for a kneeling pillow or a cushion, maybe a prayer book, and also rosary beads. Now, previously, prie-dieus would only feature, for higher clergy in the Middle Ages, but later it was used as in domestic homes, and in most cases you would find it in bedrooms and also beneath a religious picture. And now we come to the collection of Maltese wall clocks. They're of great historical significance as local decorative arts because they are unique in its type and there are no parallels elsewhere. So This one, we call the hanging clock as Arloġ tal-Lira. And as you can see, this hanging clock is mainly a wooden box. The face would be plastered white, and then it would be designed, the dial would be designed with Roman numbers, and also a naive scene of maritime scene in this case, but it could be any other scene according to the preference of the one who would commission it. And with stylized flowers on the border to make it more charming. Now, these clocks were commonly painted either in dark green, as this one, or red, or even black, but you always find them gilded. They would have ornamentation of gilding. It probably would be ordered as a set to match other painted and gilded furniture in the same room. And now we come, to an important point in the presentation where there is connection with Philadelphia. In mid-18th century, Maltese men, named Giovanni Pace had an iron foundry called Mount Holly Iron Furnace in New Jersey, where he practiced his trade of bell casting. Together with another American brass founder, John Stowe, from Philadelphia, he was commissioned by Pennsylvania government to recast the bell that was known as the State Hall Bell. The building is now called Independence Hall, since it served as the site of the signing of the Declaration of Independence of America. I say recast because the bell was broken into small pieces at Stowe's foundry, which was on the 2nd Street. It was melted down and cast into a new bell. So Stowe and Giovanni Pace, then known as John Pace in America, decided that the metal was too brittle and added copper to it. The recast bell was ready in 1753, and the creators included their names and the date. So we find Pace and Stowe and 1753 on the lower part of the bell. And since the 19th century, the bell came to be called Liberty Bell as the name adopted by the American Anti-Slavery Society during the days of movement to abolish slavery. And it is quite an honor for us that Giovanni Pace, our Giovanni Pace and your John Pace, has his name inscribed on one of the most important symbols in America. And in Malta, there is a street that carries his name, John Pace Street in Cospicua. We move to the end of the 18th century when General Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Malta. There's been celebration of his 200th anniversary. And he managed to evict the Order of St. John after over 250 years of reign. Now, at that time, the general was 29 years old. He stayed in Malta only for 6 days. And he wrote the first political and social constitution in Malta that set a long way to the future of freedom and independence. He implemented social and administrative reforms based on the principles of the French Revolution, and he abolished feudal aristocratic titles, slavery, and inquisition, and promoted equality, justice, secularism, health, and education. The French occupation lasted about 2 years because at one point the French soldiery demanded to be paid, and they began looting precious gold and silver from our churches. And that caused the Maltese to rebel against the French. But we do have an exceptional artifact in the collection that has a close connection with the French Revolution. The 18th century decimal dial watch, made by the distinguished watchmaker Robert Robin in Paris in about 1797. Now, Robin enjoyed the patronage of both King Louis XVI and later as the revolutionary government. He was deeply involved with traditional timekeeping that changed to the decimal time system. So here we have a watch that is divided into 10 hours, And again, each subdivided into 100 decimal minutes, and each minute again divided into 100 decimal seconds. So as you can see, especially on the left-hand top corner, the decimal watch is signed Robin à Paris #2. It is one of the very few surviving examples, as decimal time was abolished in 1804. It was then during the British period that the Golshers arrived in Malta in 1848. Olaf Sr. of Swedish origin had established the family shipping business here to operate ships from Malta to North Africa, Sicily and the Adriatic coast. And here we have a commemorative painting by Girolamo Gianni showing one of the ships called Swollen, owned by the Golsher family, entering the majestic Grand Harbor of Malta. And I'd like to take you through names that I've been mentioning. So there is Olaf Sr., the one we've just mentioned, that he established a business in Malta, who married a Maltese lady from a wealthy family, Vincenza Bruno Olivier. They had, God bless them, 10 children. One of them was Gustav, the one in the center here, who also married a Maltese lady from a renowned family, the Balbi. So he married Elisa, and they only had one son, our Olaf. So at the bottom there, and who married Teresa Prior, known more as Nella. They married at a late stage. I mean, he enjoyed his bachelor life, you know, and at the end of his 40s, he decided to marry Nella. But they had no children. These portraits are found in the museum, in different rooms of the museum. And speaking of paintings that adorn Palazzo Falson, I wish to focus on a rather small but remarkable painting by the British artist Edward Lear, who was an avid traveler artist, diarist, and writer of verse. This splendid watercolor is of the Bay of PHOENICIAN, and it was painted in 1866. This painting was actually the starting point between a wonderful collaboration between Fondazione Patrimonio Malti and the well-known art scholar, the late Professor John Variano. And Variano had transcribed the unpublished diaries of Lear related to Malta and his life on the island, and these are housed at the Houghton Library, Harvard University. Lear's witty observations of life and the people around him at that time provide insights into the life of Malta in mid-19th century. And I must say that his paintings of the Maltese views are very, very poetic. And we come to Olaf's years during the wars. He served in both wars, world wars. He volunteered in World War I with the British Army, and in World War II, he was in charge of a section of Home Guard in the southern area of Malta, and was liaison officer as well with the 1st Battalion of the Dorsetshire Regiment. He was made captain in 1945. And during the Second World War, as you might know, Malta suffered heavily, you know, with incessant enemy bombings on the island. And in one of Olaf Golsher's diaries, which we have in our archives, he recounts what he had witnessed, like people buried under the ruins of their houses after an air raid blitz. And he says, in Vittoriosa, more dead bodies found, digging as hard as we can. I am doing the whole job. This is a good sign, as it shows that I can manage some. And even his wife Nella did her part during the war. She was an officer in the nursing division of St. John's Ambulance Brigade, and we do know that she gave first aid courses even within Palazzo Falson to the locals. And on the 15th of April 1942, the Maltese people were awarded the George Cross by King George VI. to bear witness to the heroism and devotion of its people. This was the first time that such an award was given to the entire civilian population. The George Cross was incorporated in our national flag in 1943, and it remains so in the current design of the Maltese flag. It is also worth noting that during the war, the first Americans to arrive in Malta were those of the 21st Engineer Aviation Regiment of the USAAF. This was in June 1943, and they constructed an airstrip at Chowki Yangozo in only 18 days. Remarkable. And in September 1943, General Eisenhower, known as General Ike, who knew Malta well, chose the island as the headquarters for the initial invasion of Sicily in World War II. And I quote, he chose it because of her splendid naval communications system. And he gave orders from the Lascaris war rooms in Valletta. And an almost forgotten event of World War II was the secret signing of the Italian armistice document on the board HMS Nelson in Malta's Grand Harbour in September of 1943. And by the end of that year, President Franklin Roosevelt visited Malta and presented an illuminated scroll in admiration of the bravery of the Maltese during the war. The original scroll is held at the National Library of Malta, and these words are even engraved on the facade of the Grand Master's Palace in Valletta. And once again, President Roosevelt came to Malta in January 1945 to meet UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill, a very important meeting to plan the final campaign against the Germans with the combined chiefs of staff. And Malta also has a long, and strong ties with the British royalty that go back to the time when the late Prince Philip was serving in the Royal Navy. 2 years after marrying Princess Elizabeth, he returned to the naval service as second in command of HMS Chequers and leader of the flotilla of the Mediterranean fleet that was based in Malta. Elizabeth flew to Malta to join him, and they spent many months between 1949 and 1951. It was a carefree life at the time for them in Malta, and they stayed at Villa Guardamangia, which is now being restored to its former glory by Heritage Malta. And Malta was the only place that they called home besides the UK. And after Elizabeth then became queen in 1953, the royal couple visited on other occasions to Malta. But Prince Philip also visited alone on several other occasions to attend events and play polo. Yet perhaps the foremost visit was in 1964 when he handed the formal documents granting Malta's independence to Prime Minister George Bush-Olivier. So therefore, closing one of the most important periods in Maltese history and opening the next. And speaking of self-rule, it was way back in 1853, this is 100 years before, when US President Abraham Lincoln advocated Malta's independence. He held strong views on Malta's political destiny, and he questioned, what right has Britain to annex Gibraltar and Malta? And as a matter of principle, he believed that true liberty will never exist before the recognition to all peoples of their legitimate independence. So then, as I said, in 1964, Malta became independent, but there were other events that marked the constitutional progress. This took 10 years later, in 1974, when the Parliament of Malta approved amendments to the constitution to become a republic within the Commonwealth. So the Queen did not remain Malta's head of state, and instead she was replaced by the President of the Republic of Malta. And a few years later, in 1979, the foreign military bases of the island closed down permanently. And we come to another American president, just a few weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. President George H.W. Bush and Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev flew into Malta for the Malta Summit, which marked the end of the Cold War. They met on the Soviet cruise ship Maxim Gorky in Birza, and it was very, very bad weather on that day. We also follow with pride Maltese immigrants who have made a success abroad, and most recently it was Mayor Pete Buttigieg, the American Maltese and son of Joseph Buttigieg, who hailed from Hamrun. So congratulations on your appointment, Secretary Pete, and we wish you best of luck as Secretary of Transportation. Then Malta joined the European Union in 2004 and adopted the euro in 2008. And in between, Palazzo Falson was being restored and it opened to the general public in 2007, thanks to the Olaf Golscher Foundation and the great effort and passion for the preservation of our heritage, Fondazione Patrimonio Malti. And please allow me to end the presentation by showing you around Palazzo Falson. So this is Mdina, cradle of cultural heritage of Malta. It's fortified, and there is the Cathedral of St. Paul that you see there, and nestled in the narrow streets of Mdina is also Palazzo Falson. So this is the facade which we have seen. Then once you walk through the door, there is this entrance hall. Notice the thick walls, which takes you to the central courtyard, and then to the refectory, where we see the door that was hidden, the original 13th century door there. And this is the kitchen that all of you used to call the trattoria, the armory where we saw the helmet. His studio, because he was an artist, so we have a small display of his paintings there, most of which were painted in the 1920s. And then we go to the first floor. This is the landing. It's a maritime gallery here. His study, the drawing room, which leads to the dining room on one side and the sitting room on the other. The chapel, which one would find in most of noble or patrician houses in Malta. The bedroom. This is just one of the carpets. We have around 80 oriental carpets in the museum. Just a few are hanging and the rest are adorning the rooms. And the archaeological and documents collection room is the last room of the palazzo. Then the tour ends with stunning views from the roof terrace. We also have a lovely coffee shop, which was named Gustav after Olaf's father, Gustav Golscher. And we also added the pollinator haven, which allows bees and other pollinators to forage on indigenous and Mediterranean plants. We are doing our bit to help improve our environment. And this brings me to an end of the presentation. I am so grateful for being invited by the Philadelphia Club and the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. Thank you very much, Jay and Barbara and Anthony as well, for this opportunity to showcase Palazzo Falson and our heritage, our Maltese heritage. I also wish to thank the group of research volunteers who are very patient with me and always sharing with me their discoveries from our archives. Jan, Ellen, George, Hanneke, Cecilia, and Martin. I would also like to say thank you to Dr. Giovanni Bonello for his invaluable work. And my gratitude also goes to the dedicated staff at Palazzo Falson and Fondazione Patrimonio Malti. I also thank my family for always supporting me in all that I love doing. So thank you, all of you who have patiently listened to this presentation, and I hope that you have enjoyed it, and I'm here to answer in the best possible way questions and curiosities that you have about Malta and mostly Palazzo Falson.
Caroline, thank you so much. That was a very varied talk, and we learned so much not only about your institution, but about Malta and its history. And we do indeed have a number of questions. I also want to thank you for your wonderful images. You obviously took great pains to illustrate your lecture, and they were very effective. Now, I noticed the slide that you have on at the moment, just a personal question, reminds me of the 14th century staircase at the Bargello in Florence. And it's probably a typical medieval staircase. But I wanted to ask you, do you have any information as to whether the architect of Palazzo Falson was an Italian or was somebody homegrown?
So what we know is that there was a certain architect, De Mech, which is the Mech now, and he was very much involved in the construction of the first floor, because originally Palazzo Falson was only a ground floor. And then in the 15th century, the first floor was built. So we do have records of the architect or master mason, as they were called at the time, who erected the first floor, the piano nobile, in the style of previous architecture. So he really kept the style. And then obviously Olaf Golscher, he bought the palazzo in 1927 together with his mother. And when she passed away in 1935, he inherited obviously the whole building, and he bought another part, which is where we're seeing the staircase of the central courtyard. So he sort of bought another piece to add to the palazzo. I mean, the footprint of Palazzo Falson was much bigger, but obviously over the centuries it changed orientation and it became smaller, but it was always inhabited. This is the speciality of Palazzo Falson. And Olaf Golscher was adding more, like the staircase that you mentioned was during Olaf Golscher's period. So it's a 20th century addition, which he was being inspired from his travels, and in Florence especially. So we do have some drawings, for example, and pictures. Actually, I brought with me, if you can see, this is a postcard in our archives, which shows the fountain of the Benedictine convent in Monreale in Sicily, in Palermo. And it's a replica of our fountain. So Olaf Golscher was, this is a postcard actually, he was inspired by places that he was visiting. He was sketching in his notebooks. We have, several sketchbooks, several photos that show that he wanted to bring with him things that he was seeing abroad. And most of his youth was spent in Rome. So you can imagine the influence comes from there.
Thank you. We have a question. One person asks, I believe the unique diversity of the Maltese population history includes Russians and the Jewish community. Is that correct?
Yes.
What can you tell us about that?
I did not go into much detail. I did mention that the Jewish community was present in the 13th century. It is believed that Palazzo Falson is built on the synagogue area. So this is written by scholars. It's thought that it is in that area. So there is connection, obviously, with Jews. and Russians came later on when they were exiled to Malta.
By the way, one of our members who unfortunately could not be with us today, I wish he were here, Robert Peck of the Academy of Natural Sciences, has written a book about the natural history of Edward Lear. So I'm sure he's going to be very pleased to see
Wonderful.
the recording of this talk and your illustration of Edward Lear. Thank you for mentioning the other Philadelphia connections. We have to make sure that you have a reproduction of the Liberty Bell in your museum, as we cannot loan you the original one. Now we have a question here from somebody who lives on Malta, and he thought it might be interesting for participants to learn why the Knights of Malta have an 8-pointed star as their emblem. Now, that might be something that's beyond your knowledge, but if it is, and you'd like to
try to answer as best as I can, but it represents the virtues of the knights. So it's based on these 8 golden rules. And one must also bear in mind the different lungs, the different nationalities that came together in this aristocratic organization from all over the world.
Well, I know they spent a good part of their time.
There are a lot of experts in Malta.
When they weren't in Europe and the Middle East. And the Islamics have the Muslims have their own version of an 8-pointed star, the Khatim Suleiman, the seal of the prophets. And I don't know, that's also of medieval origin. I wonder if that was any inspiration for the star, the 8-pointed star adopted by the...
I wouldn't dare delve into an area that I'm not an expert in. Okay. There are several other professionals and scholars.
Now, we have another question about the visitors that you get at the Palazzo. Where are most of your visitors from that come from outside Malta?
Mostly from France, England, Italy. So those would fare as top visitors, and then from all over the world, really. But yes, those are the top 3 nationals that visit our museum.
And I assume from the United States, I don't know of any direct flights we have to Malta, but we certainly from Philadelphia have them to Italy, and there must be frequent flights to you from there.
Yeah, it's just 1-hour flight from Rome to Malta.
So we have a question, and I don't believe I caught this, but why is the name of the Palazzo the Falson rather than they say the Palazzo Gulcher? Yes. I assume because it was historically known as Falson, and does that have a meaning?
No, it's because the first documented family that resided in the Palazzo were the Falsone family. So Fondazione Patrimonio Malti thought it was, the right time to change from what Olaf Gulcher named the Roman house, which was not of that period, it was of a later period, by naming at least the first family that have been documented as residents of the Palazzo. So it was named Palazzo Falson. However, it was the Olaf Gulcher Foundation that owns the Palazzo, and Fondazione Patrimonio Malti was given the trust of this Palazzo to manage it.
Now, another one of your neighbors in Malta writes that it might be interesting to explain how the Knights got Malta after losing Rhodes to the Ottomans. You know anything about, or is that outside of?
Well, no, it's sort of general knowledge that the Knights were given Malta as a home because they had no home. They left. Their base was in Rhodes. It was not their intention to come to Malta, but then King Charles of Spain gave them Malta to be their new base. It was central for them. They weren't very keen at first because they felt that it was, very arid at the time, and they did surveys before they landed here. But then they realized the importance of its strategic position for their naval base, which was instrumental. And at first they were in the southern part of the island, a port town. And then after the Great Siege, they felt that they should build a city. And they built Valletta, the city for gentlemen, as we call it.
Now, one of our viewers submits the fact that astronaut Senator Harrison Schmitt, a lunar module pilot of Apollo 17, visited the Palazzo. Do you get many American visitors?
We do get North Americans, yes. Not very often, but most of them are very much interested. They are interested not only in Palazzo Falson, because this is one of the gems that we have in Malta, but we have many, many others. So they find it very exciting in such a small place. There's it's all condensed. It's like a living open museum where you walk even in streets, say Valletta, the three cities, the Grand Harbor, Mdina. So there's a lot to see in very short distance, and you can cover so much in a day. And I think that's really, I think, impresses Americans when they're here because of its size. Malta is so tiny and yet so rich in its culture. And I think that is something that is
now I'm going to allow one last question as we're at the top of the hour. We have a question about the Oriental carpets that Olaf Golcher brought back from his travels to far-off lands. Can you make any comment about those?
We have a lovely collection. As I said, there are around 80 carpets that are, they're displayed as part of the furnishing of the house. And they give warmth to, because our houses are made of limestone, so they get quite cold in winter. And these lovely patterns of different colors and coming from different countries give such a rich texture and ambience to the museum. The problem with the collection of Palazzo Falson, most of the time we don't know the provenance. It's a private collection that maybe that came down from the family. They had a palazzo. As I said, Olaf was living for quite a long time with his family in Rome, with his parents. So it could be that they brought some of these carpets from their palazzo in Rome. But we don't have the exact provenance of these carpets. They were, their business was shipping, so it would not have been a problem for them to get hold of these precious objects. And they're a wealthy family as well.
Well, Caroline, we want to thank you for playing cultural ambassador of Malta to America today. And obviously you've established so many common areas of interest between us that we hope to make an in-person visit to Malta, and we will have you come touch the Liberty Bell yourself. Have you ever seen it in person?
I'd love that, yes.
Well, yeah, but all of you and your friends of the Palazzo and the patrons of the Patrimony are welcome to come in person to the Philadelphia Club, and we'll treat you to drinks. And thank you for sharing your beautiful country and the Palazzo with us today.
Thank you once again, and I really invite everyone to come and see the Palazzo. It's much better, than seeing it on screen and the rest of Malta. So thank you again.
All the best. Bye-bye.